and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Citizen of the Galaxy by Robert Heinlein. Thorby is back on Earth, has learned that his real name is Thor Rudbeck, and that he is the heir to a vast fortune and a huge and complex financial empire. It's all rather a lot to take in when you were raised as a street beggar. So he's trying to take it in, and for that he needs a place to study. So his cousin and friend Lida is helping him set up such an office. He discovered that Rudbeck was connected with their offices in Rudbeck City by a high-speed sliding tunnel. They arrived in a private foyer guarded by an elderly receptionist. She looked up. "Hello, Miss Lida. How nice to see you." "You too, Aggie. Will you tell Daddy we're here?" "Of course." She looked at Thorby. "Oh," said Lida, "I forgot. This is Rudbeck of Rudbeck." Aggie jumped to her feet. "Oh, dear me, I didn't know. I'm sorry, sir." Things happened quickly. In minutes, Thorby found himself with an office of quiet magnificence, with a quietly magnificent secretary who addressed him by his double-barreled title, but expected him to call her Dolores. There seemed to be unlimited genies ready to spring out of the walls at a touch of her finger. Lida stuck with him until he was installed, then said, "I'll run along since you insist on being a dull old businessman." She looked at Dolores. "Or will it be dull? Perhaps I should stay." But she left. Thorby was intoxicated with being immensely wealthy and powerful. Top executives called him Rudbeck, junior executives called him Rudbeck of Rudbeck, and those still more junior crowded their words with sirs. He could judge status by how he was addressed. While he was not yet active in business, he saw Weemsby rarely and Judge Bruder almost never. Anything he wanted appeared quickly. A word to Dolores, and a respectful young man popped in to explain legal matters. Another word, and an operator appeared to show moving stereo colors of business interests anywhere, even on other planets. He spent days looking at such pictures, yet still did not see them all. His office became so swamped with books, spools, charts, brochures, presentations, file jackets, and figures that Dolores had the office next door refitted as a library. There were figures on figures describing in fiscal analog enterprises too vast to comprehend otherwise. There were so many figures, so intricately related, that his head ached. He began to have misgivings about the vocation of tycoon. It wasn't all just being treated with respect, going through doors first and always getting what you asked for. What was the point if you were so snowed under that you could not enjoy it? Being a guardsman was easier. Still, it was nice to be important. Most of his life he had been nobody, and at best he had been very junior. If only Pop could see him now, surrounded by lavish furnishings, a barber to trim his hair while he worked, Pop used to cut it under a bowl, a secretary to anticipate his wishes, and dozens of people eager to help. But Pop's face in this dream was wearing Pop's reproving expression. Thorby wondered what he had done wrong, and dug harder into the mess of figures. Eventually, a pattern began to emerge. The business was Rudbeck and Associates Limited. So far as Thorby could tell, this firm did nothing. It was chartered as a private investment trust and just owned things. Most of what Thorby would own when his parents' wills were proved was stock in this company. Nor would he own all of it. He felt almost poverty-stricken when he discovered that mother and father together held only 18% of many thousand shares. Then he found out about voting and non-voting. The shares coming to him were 18/40ths of the voting shares. The remainder was split between relatives and non-relatives. Rudbeck and Associates owned stock in other companies, and here it got complicated. Galactic Enterprises, Galactic Acceptance Corporation, Galactic Transport, Interstellar Metals, Three Planets Fiscal, which operated on 27 planets, Havermeyer Laboratories, which ran barge lines and bakeries, as well as research stations. The list looked endless. These corporations, trusts, cartels, and banking houses seemed as tangled as spaghetti. Thorby learned that he owned, through his parents, an interest in a company called Honus Brothers Private, through a chain of 6 companies, 18% of 31% of 42% of 19% of 44% of 27%, a share so microscopic that he lost track. But his parents owned directly 7% of Honus Brothers, with the result that his indirect interest of 1/20th of 1% controlled it utterly, but paid little return, whereas 7% owned directly did not control, but paid 140 times as much. It began to dawn on him that control and ownership were only slightly related. He had always thought of ownership and control as being the same thing. You owned a thing, a begging bowl or a uniform jacket, of course you controlled it. The converging, diverging, and crossing of corporations and companies confused and disgusted him. It was as complex as a fire control computer without a computer's cool logic. He tried to draw a chart and could not make it work. The ownership of each entity was tangled in common stocks, preferred stocks, bonds, senior and junior issues, securities with odd names and unknown functions. Sometimes one company owned a piece of another directly, and another piece through a third, or 2 companies might each own a little of the other, or sometimes a company owned part of itself in a tail-swallowing fashion. It didn't make sense. This wasn't business. What the people did was business: buy, sell, make a profit. But this was a silly game with wild rules. Something else fretted him. He had not known that Rudbeck built spaceships. Galactic Enterprises controlled Galactic Transport, which built ships in one of its many divisions. When he realized it, he felt a glow of pride, then discovered gnawing uneasiness. Something Colonel Brisby had said, something Pop had proved, that the largest, or it might have been one of the largest, builders of starships was mixed up in the slave trade. He told himself he was being silly. This beautiful office was about as far from the dirty business of slave traffic as anything could be. But as he was dropping to sleep one night, he came wide awake with the black, ironic thought that one of those slave ships in whose stinking holds he had ridden might have been at that very time the property of the scabby, frightened slave he was then. It was a nightmare notion. He pushed it away, but it took the fun out of what he was doing. One afternoon, he sat studying a long memorandum from the legal department, a summary, so it said, of Rudbeck and Associates' interests, and found that he had dragged to a halt. It seemed as if the writer had gone out of his way to confuse things. It would have been as intelligible in ancient Chinese. More so, Sargonese included many Mandarin borrows. He sent Dolores out and sat with his head in his hands. Why, oh why hadn't he been left in the guard? He'd been happy there. He had understood the world he was in. Then he straightened up and did something he had been putting off. He returned a view call from his grandparents. He had been expected to visit them long since, but he had felt compelled to try and learn his job first. Indeed, he was welcome. Hurry, son, we'll be waiting. It was a wonderful hop across prairie and the mighty Mississippi, small from that height, and over city-pocked farmlands to the sleepy college town of Valley View, where sidewalks were stationary and time itself seemed slowed. His grandparents' home, imposing for Valley View, was homey after the awesome halls of Rudbeck. But the visit was not relaxing. There were guests at dinner, the president of the college and department heads, and many more after dinner. Some called him Rudbeck of Rudbeck, others addressed him uncertainly as Mr. Rudbeck, and still others, smug with misinformation about how the nabob was addressed by familiars, simply as Rudbeck. His grandmother twittered around happily, happy as only a proud hostess can be, and his grandfather stood straight and addressed him loudly as son. Thorby did his best to be a credit to them. He soon realized that it was not what he said, but the fact of talking to Rudbeck that counted. The following night, which his grandmother reluctantly kept private, he got a chance to talk. He wanted advice. First, information was exchanged. Thorby learned that his father, on marrying the only child of his grandfather Rudbeck, had taken his wife's family name. "It's understandable," Grandfather Bradley told him. "Rudbeck has to have a Rudbeck. Martha was heir, but Crichton had to preside, board meetings and conferences, and at the dinner table for that matter. I had hoped that my son would pursue the muse of history as I have, but when this came along, what could I do but be happy for him?" His parents and Thorby himself had been lost as a consequence of his father's earnest attempt to be in the fullest sense Rudbeck of Rudbeck. He'd been trying to inspect as much of the commercial empire as possible. The father was always conscientious, and when your grandfather Rudbeck died before your father completed his apprenticeship, so to speak, Crichton left John Weemsby in charge. John is, I suppose you know, the second husband of your grandmother's youngest sister, Arya. And Lita, of course, is Arya's daughter by her first marriage. No, I hadn't known. Thorby translated the relationships into Sisu terms and reached the startling conclusion that Lita was in the other moiety. If they had such things here, which they didn't. And Uncle Jack, well, he wasn't uncle, but how would you say it in English? John had been a business secretary and factotum to your other grandfather, and he was the perfect choice, of course. He knew the inner workings better than anyone except your grandfather himself. After we got over the shock of our tragic loss, we realized the world must go on, and that John could handle it as well as if he had been Rudbeck himself. "He's been simply wonderful," Grandmother chirped. "Yes, he has. I must admit that your grandmother and I became used to a comfortable scale of living after Crichton married. College salaries are never what they should be. Crichton and Martha were very generous. Your grandmother and I might have found it difficult after we realized that our son was gone, never to come back, and Aunt John told us not to worry. He saw to it that our benefit continued just as before." "And increased it," Grandmother Bradley added emphatically. "Well, yes, all the family. We think of ourselves as part of the Rudbeck family, even though we bear a proud name of our own. All the family have been pleased with John's stewardship." Thorby was interested in something other than Uncle Jack's virtues. "You told me that we left Akka jumping for Farstar and never made it. That's a long, long way from Jubal." "I suppose it is. The college has only a small galactoview, and I must admit it is hard to realize that what appears to be an inch or so is actually many light years." "About 170 light years in this case." "Let me see, how much would that be in miles?" "You don't measure it that way any more than you measure that couch mat you're on in microns." "Come now, young man, don't be pedantic." "I wasn't being, Grandfather. I was thinking that it was a long way from where I was captured to where I was last sold. I hadn't known it." "I heard you use that term sold once before. You must realize that is not correct. After all, the serfdom practiced in the Sargany is not chattel slavery. It derives from the ancient Hindu guild or caste system, a stabilized social order with mutual obligations up and down. You must not call it slavery." "I don't know any other word to translate the Sarganese term." "I could think of several, though I don't know Sarganese. It's not a useful tongue in scholarship. But, my dear Thor, you aren't a student of human histories and culture. Grant me a little authority in my own field." "Well," Thorby felt baffled. "I don't know system English perfectly, and there's a lot of history I don't know. There's an awful lot of history." "So there is, as I'm the first to admit." "But I can't translate any better. I was sold, and I was a slave." "Now, son, don't contradict your grandfather, dear. There's a good boy." Thorby shut up. He had already mentioned his years as a beggar, and discovered that his grandmother was horrified, had felt that he had disgraced himself, though she did not quite say so. And he had already found that while his grandfather knew much about many things, he was just as certain of his knowledge when Thorby's eyes had reported things differently. Thorby concluded glumly that it was part of being senior and nothing could be done about it. He listened while Grandfather Bradley discoursed on the history of the 9 worlds, and though it did not agree with what the Sarganese believed, but it wasn't too far from what Pop had taught him, other than about slavery. He was glad when the talk drifted back to the Rudbeck organization. He admitted his difficulties. "You can't build Rome in a day, Thor. Looks as if I could never learn. I've been thinking about going back into the Guard." His grandfather frowned. "That would not be wise." "Why not, sir?" "If you don't have talent for business, there are other honorable professions." "Meaning the Guard isn't?" Your grandmother and I are philosophical pacifists. It cannot be denied that there is never a moral justification for taking human life." "Never," agreed Grandmother firmly. Thorby wondered what Pop would think. Shucks, he knew. Pop cut him down like grass to rescue a load of slaves. "What do you do when a raider jumps you?" "A what?" "A pirate. You've got a pirate on your tail and closing fast." "Why, you run, I suppose. It's not moral to stay and do battle. Thor, nothing is ever gained by violence." "But you can't run. He has more legs. It's you or him." "You mean he. Then you surrender. That defeats his purpose, as the immortal Gandhi proved." Thorby took a deep breath. "Grandfather, I'm sorry, but it doesn't defeat his purpose. You have to fight. Raiders take slaves. The proudest thing I ever did was to burn one." "Eh? Burn one?" "Hit him with a target seeker. Blast him out of the sky." Grandmother gasped. At last his grandfather said stiffly, "Thor, I'm afraid you've been exposed to bad influences. Not your fault, perhaps, but you have many misconceptions, both in fact and in evaluation. Now be logical. If you burned him, as you say, how do you know he intended, again, as you say, to take slaves? What could he do with them? Nothing." Thorby kept silent. It made a difference which side of the plaza you saw things from, and if you didn't have status, you weren't listened to. That was a universal rule. Grandfather Bradley continued, "So we'll say no more about it. On this other matter, I'll give you the advice I would give your departed father. If you feel you have no head for trade, you don't have to enter it. But to run away and join the Guard like some childish romantic, no, son. But you needn't make up your mind for years. John is a very stable regent. You don't have a decision facing you." He stood up. "I know, for I've discussed this with John, and he's willing, in all humility, to carry the burden a little farther, or much farther if need be. And now we had all better seek our pillows. Morning comes early." Thorby left the next morning with polite assurances that the house was his, which made him suspect that it really was. He went to Rudbeck City, having reached a decision during a restless night. He wanted to sleep with a live ship around him. He wanted to be back in Pop's outfit. Being a billionaire boss was not his style. He had to do something. Dig out those papers that Father and Mother had signed, compare them with the ones prepared for him, since Father must have known what was needed, sign them so that Jack could get on with the work after he was gone. Grandfather was right about that. John Weemsby knew how to do the job, and he didn't. He should be grateful to Uncle Jack. He would thank him before he left. Then off Terra and out to where people talked his language. He buzzed Uncle Jack's office as soon as he reached his own, was told he was out of town. He decided that he would write a note and make it sound better. "Oh, yes, must say goodbye to Lida." So he buzzed the legal department and told him to dig his parents' authorizations out of the vault and send them to his office. Instead of papers, Judge Bruder arrived. "Rudbeck, what's this about your ordering certain papers from the vault?" Thorby explained, "I want to see them." "No one but officers of the company can order papers from the vault." "What am I?" "I'm afraid you are a young man with confused notions. In time you will have authority, but at the moment you are a visitor, learning something about your parents' affairs." Thorby swallowed. It was true, no matter how it tasted. I've been meaning to ask you about that. What's the progress in the court action to have my parents declared dead? You're trying to bury them? Of course not, but it has to be done, or so Uncle Jack says. So where are we? Bruder sniffed. Nowhere, through your doing. What do you mean? Young man, do you think that the officers of this company will initiate a process which would throw the affairs of the firm into incredible confusion unless you take necessary steps to guard against it? Why, it may take years to settle the wills, during which business would come to a stop, simply because you neglected to sign a few simple instruments which I prepared weeks ago. You mean nothing will be done until I sign? That is correct. I don't understand. Suppose I were dead, or had never been born. Does business stop every time a Rudbeck dies? Well, no. A court authorizes matters to proceed, but you are here, and we must take that into consideration. Now see here, I'm at the very end of my patience. You seem to think simply because you've read a few balance sheets that you understand business. You don't. For example, your belief that you can order instruments turned over to you that were given to John Weemsby personally and are not even company property. If you were to attempt to take charge of the firm at this time, if we proceeded with your notion to have your parents declared dead, I can see that we would have all sorts of confusion while you were finding your balance. We can't afford it. The company can't afford it. Rudbeck can't afford it. So I want those papers signed today and no more shilly-shallying. Do you understand? Thorby lowered his head. I won't. What do you mean you won't? I won't sign anything until I know what I'm doing. If I can't even see the papers my parents signed, then I certainly won't. We'll see about that. I'm going to sit tight until I find out what's going on around here. Well, there's a decent chance you will find out what's going on around here next time.